She had memorized 3 different versions of her own childhood, one for official documents, one for social situations, one for the moments when someone pushed a little too hard, and she needed a story that felt lived in enough to survive pressure. She was 28 years old. She had been doing this long enough that she no longer always knew which version was true. Her name, for the purposes of this operation, was Dina Farouk, daughter of a Lebanese textile merchant, mother from Alexandria, educated in Beirut, then Paris, recently returned to the Arab world after a period abroad that was described, when it needed to be described at all, as personal. She was not Lebanese. She had never lived in Beirut. Her mother was not from Alexandria, but she had attended school in Paris. She did speak fluent French. She did know the film world, its rhythms, its personalities, particular grammar of self-importance and genuine passion from the inside. The best covers are not invented. They are extracted from something real, stretched over a frame that does not exist, and then worn until the seams stop showing. Dina Farouk's cover had taken 11 months to build. By the time Miriam stepped off a plane in Cairo in February 1974, she had been living inside it in fragments, in test conversations, in dry runs, in the small daily practice of thinking like someone else, long enough that it had begun to feel like a second skin. The question no one had fully answered was how long a second skin holds. To understand why Mossad sent an actress into Cairo in the winter of 1974, you have to understand what an actress actually is inside a closed society. In Egypt in the early 1970s, celebrity was passage. A recognized face at a military function, a diplomatic dinner, private gathering of generals and ministers did not trigger the social alarm that a journalist or a foreign diplomat would. Famous actress was expected to be in these rooms. Her presence was currency. Her conversation was considered harmless. She was scenery, not threat. This assumption that artists are decorative and therefore safe is one of the most persistent and most exploited blind spots in the history of intelligence work. Mossad had used it before. They intended to use it again. What made this operation different was not the concept. It was the specific woman they had chosen to carry it. Miriam was not Israeli by birth. She had grown up in a coastal Mediterranean city with 2 languages and 3 overlapping loyalties, the child of a family that had existed between worlds for generations. Her father had run a small import business. Her mother had been a musician who gave lessons from the front room of a house that always smelled of coffee and rosin. She had trained as an actress in Paris, at a conservatory whose method was less about performance and more about disappearance. The specific discipline of inhabiting a role so completely that the seam between the actor and the character becomes invisible even to the actor. She had worked in theater, in independent film, in the small productions that never become famous but teach something more valuable than fame, how to exist inside a lie without the lie existing inside you. She was recruited by the man she would know only as the engineer. Mossad case officer who had introduced himself at a cultural event in Paris in 1969 as a documentary filmmaker. He was charming, well-read. He asked no questions that seemed strange. He made no requests that seemed inappropriate. For 4 years he was simply a friend. 4 years. That is the first number worth sitting with in this story. Because the patience it represents, 4 years of a relationship built toward a purpose the other person does not know, is not a recruitment technique. It is a demolition project. Slow, precise, invisible. By 1973, when the engineer finally told Miriam who he worked for and what he needed, she had known him long enough that the truth arrived inside a friendship she considered real. She said yes. She said yes without knowing the full shape of what she was agreeing to. She understood she would provide access. She did not yet understand that she would be asked to become someone else entirely, or that the someone else had already been built around her, fitted to her specific instincts and gifts long before she agreed to anything. The cover identity was not built to fit the operation. The operation was built to fit her. The target's name was General Fouad Khalil. He was not the most powerful man in the Egyptian military. He was not the most decorated. He had not led armies across the Suez Canal. He was, in the assessment of Israeli intelligence, something more valuable than either of those things. He was the man who knew what everyone else was planning. 15 years in Egyptian military intelligence, signals, counterintelligence. liaison with the Soviet advisors who had flooded into Egypt after the humiliation of 1967. He had worked inside the machinery of Egyptian military decision-making long enough to understand not just what the machine produced, but where it was. Broken, he knew which air defense batteries destroyed in the Yom Kippur War genuinely been rebuilt, and which ones had been classified as operational on paper, while remaining crippled on the ground. He knew the true state of the Soviet resupply relationship, specifically the early signals of a disengagement that would leave Egypt far more exposed than its public posture admitted. He knew which senior officers supported Sadat's emerging peace overtures and which ones were waiting for Sadat to fall. He knew, in other words, the gap between what Egypt said it was and what it actually was. That gap was exactly what Israeli intelligence needed to understand. The direct approach to Khalil had failed. He was too senior, too careful, too embedded in the intelligence world for a conventional recruitment to be anything other than immediately reported. Technical collection could not reach his private conversations. Official liaison channels produced only what Khalil chose to produce. The crack in the wall was behavioral, not structural. Khalil was careful in professional contexts, he maintained, inside the bureaucratic machinery of Egyptian intelligence, exactly the kind of controlled opacity that 30 years of working in that world had taught him, but he was not careful in private. Every 3 weeks he hosted a gathering at his villa in the Mahdi district of Cairo. Informal salon, 12 to 20 people, artists and journalists and professors and a handful of officers' wives. The atmosphere was cultivated. The conversation was genuine. In that space, Khalil spoke about things, about Egypt's political reality, about the weight of what the 1973 war had cost and what it had failed to teach, with a frankness that was almost out of character. He had lived for 30 years inside the machinery of secrets. The dinners were his only space outside it. Israeli intelligence had identified this space. They had identified the specific social bridge, a Cairo theater critic named Barakat, genuinely well-connected, entirely unaware of his role, that could carry a new face into that room. What they needed was a face that would be accepted, that would be trusted, that would in time find itself alone with Khalil in the unguarded hour at the end of an evening when the other guests had gone home. Enter Dina Farouk. The first problem no one had fully solved was the photograph. 2 years earlier, Miriam's face had appeared in a French film magazine, small feature, minor publication, a paragraph about a European independent film she had appeared in, and a photograph that showed her in 3/4 profile. The engineer had reviewed the magazine. He had calculated the Egyptian readership as negligible. He had judged the risk of recognition as acceptable. He was right about the readership. He did not know about the woman who had read that magazine in a Paris waiting room 2 years ago, and had the kind of memory for faces that most people reserve for important things. She was not yet in the story, but she had already seen Miriam's face. The second problem was Miriam herself, not her training, not her cover, her specific quality of presence, the thing that made her exactly right for this operation, and that the engineer had perhaps not fully calculated as a liability. She was very good at making people feel understood, not performed warmth. The social technique of mirroring and deflection that intelligence training teaches. Something more fundamental than that. She listened in a way that people experienced as rare. She asked questions that revealed she had actually heard the answers. She made powerful men who spent their professional lives surrounded by people managing them, feel, for the duration of a conversation, someone was simply paying attention. This quality was the reason she had been chosen. It was also a sustained operation that would require her to form genuine relationships with real people in order to extract intelligence from them, the most dangerous thing about her. Because when a cover depends on real connection to function, the operative and the cover are no longer two separate things, and Miriam was about to walk into a room and start becoming someone she was not. The question, already present before the first dinner, before the first conversation, before she had even met the man she had been sent to reach. How much of what she was about to feel would be real? She arrived at the villa on a Thursday evening in the second week of February. Barakat had introduced her to 3 people before they reached the door. By the time they entered the main room, she had already established 2 small facts about herself that were true. one that was partially true, and one that did not exist at all. She had done this naturally, without effort, in the way that people do when they are simply making conversation. Ease was the thing Khalil noticed first. He was standing near the bookshelf when Barakat brought her across the room. 61 years old, heavyset, with a stillness about him that was not passivity. It was the controlled economy of a man who had learned over decades, the most useful thing you can do in any room is watch it before you participate in it. Barakat made the introduction. Khalil gave her a standard greeting, asked one question about her work in Beirut, received a clean answer, and moved on. That was the whole of it. Across the rest of the evening, across 4 hours of shifting conversation, changing groups, particular social geometry of a dinner that runs long, she felt his attention return to her. Not obviously. The way radar works. A glance held a half-second longer than social protocol required. A comment directed at the table broadly that was angled slightly toward where she was sitting. He was assessing her. She was expecting that. What she was not expecting was that the assessment did not feel hostile. It felt, in a way she noted carefully, and did not include in her first report, like recognition. She filed through the dead drop in Zamalek 48 hours later. The drop was a loose brick in the exterior wall of a second-hand bookshop near the Gezira Sporting Club, a location chosen because the street was busy enough that no single figure lingered visibly, because the bookshop's owner was entirely uninvolved, and because the particular brick, when removed, revealed a cavity just large enough for a folded paper inside a waterproof sleeve. She had never seen the engineer in Cairo, she would not. The operation's architecture was designed so that no thread connected her to any identifiable Israeli presence in the country. She was, from the outside, exactly what she appeared to be: a Lebanese woman visiting Cairo for professional reasons, moving through cultural and social circles, planning to leave within a few weeks. Her first report was factual, measured, and professionally clean. She noted Khalil's manner. She noted the guests, their affiliations, the texture of the conversation. She noted Barakat's social position in the group and the degree of trust it carried. She noted one guest, a woman named Hana Saleh, wife of a defense ministry official, who had looked at her twice in a way that was slightly longer than normal. She assessed this as low-level social curiosity. Probably nothing. She recommended a second visit. The engineer approved it within 24 hours. What she did not know, what she would not know until the operation was over, was that by the time he approved the second visit, the engineer had already begun construction on the next phase, not just a second dinner. A sustained presence, timeline extending not weeks but months. He had not told her this yet. He told her she was going back to a dinner party. By the fourth gathering, something had shifted. Khalil had begun to direct specific remarks at her, not flirtatiously, not in the manner of a host performing attention for a new guest. It was the attention of someone who had run an assessment and arrived at a conclusion. He treated her the way he treated the professor from Cairo University who sat on his left, someone whose response to an idea was worth hearing. He asked her once, over a disagreement about whether Egyptian cinema had genuinely processed the 1967 defeat or simply aestheticized it, what she thought the difference was between art that confronts a wound and art that decorates one. She gave him an answer she had not prepared. She said, "The difference is whether the person who made it was willing to be changed by it." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "That is a harder standard than most people can meet." Then the conversation moved on. But she felt the temperature of the room change slightly, felt the way it changes when something real has briefly surfaced through the social performance. She knew that whatever had just happened between them was not part of the cover. She did not include the exchange in her report. In the 5th week, the engineer told her the timeline, not through the dead drop, through a secondary contact, a woman she knew only as the librarian, who appeared in her life as a gallery acquaintance and disappeared after 3 meetings, who delivered the message verbally and without documentation. The operation had been extended, not to 8 weeks, to an indefinite timeline, assessed monthly. The engineer's judgment was that the access was functioning at a level that justified continued exposure. Miriam was standing in a gallery in Zamalek when she received this information. She looked at a painting for a long moment. She asked the librarian a question she had not planned to ask. She asked, "Does he know?" The librarian said, "What do you mean?" Miriam said, "Khalil, does he know what I am?" The librarian said that was not an assessed risk. The cover was solid. The social introduction was clean. There was no surveillance flag on her movement or communication. Miriam said she understood. She did not say what had prompted the question. She was not entirely sure she could have explained it. It was not evidence. It was something more instinctive than evidence. The particular awareness, developed over years of inhabiting roles, of when you are being watched by someone who knows they are watching. She filed it under inconclusive and went back to work. The conversation on the veranda happened on a Tuesday evening in late March. The dinner had run long, guests left in clusters. Barakat was absorbed near the front door in a discussion that showed no sign of ending. The house staff had retreated to the back of the house. Khalil walked her toward the veranda. They sat for 40 minutes. He talked about 1973 with a frankness she had not heard from him before. Not the official narrative, not the story of Egyptian valor and the brilliant Suez crossing that had been constructed in the 18 months since the ceasefire. He talked about what had actually been lost. The missile batteries that Israel had destroyed with an accuracy that had shocked the Egyptian command. The Soviet resupply that had come and what it had failed to restore. The gap between what the military told Sadat and what the military privately understood about its own condition. He told her that the peace overtures Sadat had been floating through American intermediaries were not primarily political. They were a military acknowledgement. Egypt could not fight another war. Not yet. Possibly not for years. He stopped. He looked at her. He said, "You're very easy to talk to. I should be more careful with you." He said it with a small, self-aware smile. He meant it as a compliment. She heard it as something else entirely. Her report from that evening was the most significant intelligence the operation had produced. The engineer read it 3 times. Then he extended the operation again. Here is what the operational file did not record. 3 days after that report was filed, Miriam asked for a contact meeting. Not through the dead drop. An actual meeting, flagged as necessary, classified in the system as a cover maintenance review, conducted in a safe house in a residential building near Heliopolis. The engineer was not present. His deputy was. Miriam sat across from a man she had met twice and trusted partially and told him she wanted to discuss. Extraction, not immediately, not as a demand. As a professional assessment, she laid it out cleanly. The operation had produced its most significant intelligence. Continued presence increased cumulative exposure risk. The cover had now been active for 11 weeks against an original timeline of 6 to 8. Every additional week was a week in which a small inconsistency could surface, in which a social relationship could deepen to the point where its absence would be noticed, which someone who had looked at her twice could look a 3rd time and remember where. The deputy listened to all of it. Then he said, "The engineer's assessment is that the access is not yet exhausted." Miriam said she understood the assessment. She said, "I want it noted that I have flagged this." He said it would be noted. She left. What she did not tell him, what she held back, for reasons she examined carefully and could not fully justify professionally, was what had actually prompted the request. It was not the cumulative exposure risk, though that was real. It was the veranda. Not the intelligence. The moment before the intelligence, Khalil had sat across from her in the dark of a Cairo garden and said something that was nominally a compliment and had landed in her body as a warning, not a warning about operational security, a warning about something else. She had looked at him in that moment. A man who had spent 30 years inside the machinery of secrets and had built these evenings as his only space outside it, and she had felt, without wanting to feel it, that she understood exactly why he talked the way he did in this room. Because she was doing the same thing. She was being, in the hours she spent at his table, more genuinely herself than she was anywhere else in Cairo. The cover had not insulated her from the relationship. The cover had become the container for something she had not anticipated and could not report. She was not in danger of compromising the operation. She was in danger of minding when it ended. 48 hours after the meeting in Heliopolis, the engineer sent back his confirmation through the librarian. The operation would continue. The abort discussion was closed. Received the message on a Wednesday morning, standing in the kitchen of an apartment that belonged to a woman who did not exist. Drinking coffee she had started buying because Barakat had recommended it 3 weeks ago, looking out a window at a street in a city she was not supposed to be in. She thought about the veranda. She thought about Khalil's face in the moment before he had stopped himself, the expression of a man who had heard himself say something true and was not entirely sure how it had gotten out. She thought, "He said he should be more careful with me." And then she thought something she had not thought before, something she set aside immediately but that did not fully leave. She thought, what if he already is? The invitation to the smaller dinner arrived through Barakat. Not Khalil's usual gathering, this was different. 8 people. A retired colonel's birthday. The kind of evening that did not appear on any official calendar, and was not the sort of thing a new acquaintance was typically included in. Barakat mentioned it casually, over coffee, as though it had simply occurred to him. She said yes before she finished the sentence. She should have flagged it. The protocol for a significant change in access level, moving from the larger semi-public gatherings into a smaller, more intimate circle, required a contact report before participation, not after. Before, the engineer needed to assess whether the acceleration was organic, or whether it represented a shift in Khalil's behavior that itself carried. She filed nothing. She told herself it was a birthday dinner. She told herself the opportunity had arrived too quickly to route through the dead drop without losing it. She told herself the protocol was a guideline, not an instruction. All of this was partially true. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was that she did not want to give the engineer the opportunity to say no. The smaller dinner changed everything she thought she understood about the operation. In the larger gatherings, Khalil was a host. Charming, attentive, performing the version of himself that had been honed over decades of social navigation in a world where every room contained at least one person who might eventually be useful or dangerous. In a room of 8 with no audience, he was something else, he argued. He was impatient with received opinion. He interrupted a retired colonel mid-sentence to say that the entire Egyptian military's reading of the 1967 defeat had been so contaminated by institutional self-protection that the actual lessons had never been extracted. He said this to the colonel's face, the colonel's own birthday dinner, without apparent concern for how it landed. The colonel laughed. They had clearly had this argument before. She sat across the table and watched a man she thought she had understood reveal a layer she had not accounted for. He was not simply guarded in public, open in private. He was a man with a genuine interior life that his professional context had no room for. A man who had spent 30 years being careful and had, somewhere in that time, decided that his private hours were the only ones that belonged to him. She filed the report that night, clean, detailed, professionally structured. She did not include what she had actually felt sitting across the table from him. 3 weeks later, Hannah Saleh spoke to her directly for the first time. It was a larger gathering, 14 people, and Miriam had assessed the evening as low stakes. Khalil had been drawn into a long conversation with a professor near the window. The social traffic had been easy. She had been relaxed in a way that, retrospect, she should have recognized as a warning sign. Hannah approached her near the end of the evening. She said she had been trying to place her. She said she thought she might have seen her. In a magazine, she thought. Something European. She could not remember exactly. She said it pleasantly, conversationally, with the manner of someone solving a small puzzle that had been mildly bothering them. Miriam laughed. She said she heard it occasionally. There was apparently a minor actress. She had never seen her work, but the resemblance was something people mentioned. She found it flattering. She turned the conversation to Paris immediately, asked Hannah where she had stayed, what she had thought of the city in that particular year. Hannah answered. The conversation moved on. Miriam did not look toward Khalil. She knew with absolute certainty that he had been watching. She wrote the flag in her report that night. Hannah Saleh, Defense Ministry wife, possible prior exposure through European print media. Exchange managed, assessed as contained. She wrote assessed as contained, and she believed it when she wrote it. This was the incorrect assumption. She had read Hannah's approach as social curiosity that had been successfully deflected. She had not read it as the third step in a process that had been running for weeks without her knowledge. She did not know about the magazine. She did not know that Hannah had already found it. She thought the moment had closed. It had not closed. It had simply gone quiet. The false start came in the first week of April. Khalil had said, at the end of the previous dinner, she should come to something smaller the following week. A Sunday afternoon, 4 or 5 people, the kind of afternoon that turned into an evening. She had noted it, filed it, received approval, prepared. She arrived at the villa at 3 o'clock on a Sunday to find it quiet. The housekeeper told her that the general had been called to a meeting that morning. He sent his apologies. He hoped she would come the following week. She stood on the front step for a moment. She thanked the housekeeper and left. Walking back to her car, she ran through every possibility. A genuine cancellation. These things happened. A man in his position did not control his own calendar. A test, a deliberate absence to see how she responded, whether she asked questions she should not ask, whether she showed a level of disappointment disproportionate to the occasion. A warning, indirect signal that the access was being withdrawn. She drove back to the apartment. She did not file a report. She sat with the uncertainty for 3 days. The following Sunday, Khalil opened the door himself. He apologized for the previous week, with the ease of a man for whom the cancellation had been simply what he said it was. He brought her into a sitting room where 2 other guests were already present. Documentary filmmaker she had not met before, and a woman who turned out to be a retired signals officer's wife, sharp and funny, strong opinions about Egyptian television. The afternoon became an evening. At one point, the filmmaker asked Miriam about a specific Lebanese production company, one of the companies named in her cover biography. She answered cleanly, gave 2 names, a project, a year. The filmmaker nodded, mentioned a mutual contact she did not recognize, waited to see what she did with it. She said the name was familiar, but she could not place it. She had worked with so many people in that period. The early 1970s had been a blur of projects and introductions. The filmmaker accepted this. Khalil, sitting across the room, said nothing. She felt the weight of the moment only after it had passed. Felt with the delayed recognition of someone who had been inside a test without knowing that she had just improvised her way through a gap in the cover biography that the engineer had not filled. A gap she had not known existed. She requested a contact meeting the following morning. The deputy came. She told him about the filmmaker and the missing contact name. She told him the cover had a hole. He told her it would be patched within 48 hours. She told him she wanted to discuss the timeline again. He looked at her. She said, "We have the veranda intelligence. We have the military posture assessment. Sadat's peace calculus from a primary internal source. There is a point at which continued presence is not producing additional intelligence, producing accumulated risk." The deputy said the engineer's assessment was that Khalil had not yet reached the floor of what he knew. She said, "If the floor doesn't exist." He did not answer that. She said, "There is a woman in that circle who has looked at me 3 times in a way I do not. There is a gap in the biography that I just papered over in real time in front of a man I cannot assess. We are past the original timeline by 9 weeks." The deputy said he would convey her concerns. She said she had conveyed her concerns before. He said he understood that. The near abort came 4 days later, not from her. A signals intercept, unrelated to her operation, a separate thread in the Egyptian counterintelligence network, had flagged increased activity around Lebanese documentation checks. Not targeted, routine, but the flag had reached a desk in Tel Aviv that cross-referenced it with active operations, and for approximately 18 hours, the engineer had been within a single decision of pulling her out. She did not know this at the time. What she knew was that the dead drop had been empty for 6 days, which was 2 days past the standard response window for her last report. She went about her life in Cairo. She had coffee with Barakat. She attended a gallery opening. She was, to everyone who observed her, exactly what she had always appeared to be. Inside, she was counting days. On the 7th day, the dead drop contained a single sheet, 3 words: "Continue as planned." She stood on a street in Zamalek with the note in her hand and felt something she could not immediately name. Took her a moment to identify it. It was not relief, it was the particular sensation of a door closing behind you, not locked, not barred, simply shut, that you had not entirely decided you wanted closed. She folded the note. She kept walking. She had a dinner to prepare for. Extraction order came on a Wednesday. Not because something had broken. Because something adjacent had shifted, secondary thread in the Israeli intelligence network in Cairo, entirely unconnected to Miriam's operation, reported that Egyptian counterintelligence was running documentation checks on recent arrivals with Lebanese travel histories. Not targeted, routine. The kind of administrative sweep that happened twice a year and rarely caught anything. But the cover had a Lebanese component. The engineer, looking at the calendar, 17 weeks, against an original brief of 6 to 8, calculation that a routine sweep at week 17 was a different risk than a routine sweep at week 6. He sent the signal. Miriam received it on a Thursday morning. She had 4 days. She spent those 4 days being Dina Farouk. Not as performance, as discipline. The same coffee with Barakat on Friday, the same gallery visit on Saturday that she had mentioned 2 weeks earlier, so that canceling it would itself become a data point. She mentioned Beirut to 3 people, naturally, in the context of 3 different conversations, a family obligation, nothing dramatic. She would be back in a month. She said it the way a person says something true. On the 4th evening, she attended a small gathering at an apartment belonging to a friend of Barakat's, not Khalil's villa. Khalil was not there. She stayed 2 hours, moved through conversations she would never finish, said goodbyes that were permanent without being final. She drove back to the apartment. She packed. The packing took less time than it should have. 11 months of construction, the documents, the biography, the carefully chosen details of a life that didn't exist, collapsed into a single bag in 40 minutes. What remained in the apartment after she zipped it closed was not much. A paperback with notes in the margins. Particular tea she had started buying because Barakat had mentioned it in passing. Small pieces of a life that had been real enough to accumulate ordinary residue. She left them. She left the city the following morning on a commercial flight, carrying nothing that connected her to the operation. She sat in her seat and watched Cairo recede through the window and felt, with a precision that surprised her, exactly what she had been warned she might feel. Not relief, not completion. The specific grief of leaving a place that would continue existing without any memory of you. Dina Farouk would not be missed. She would simply be absent and then, after a while, forgotten. Barakat would mention her once or twice in passing. Khalil would not mention her at all. The city would not notice the space she left because the space had never officially existed. The debriefings lasted 3 weeks. They were thorough, professionally respectful, oriented entirely toward the intelligence that had been produced rather than the cost of producing it. The engineer ran the sessions with his usual precision. He asked the right questions. He documented her answers cleanly. He did not ask how she was. This was not cruelty. It was the operational culture she had entered willingly. The debrief was about what had been extracted, not what had been spent in the extracting. She understood this. She had understood it before she agreed to any of it. Understanding something and experiencing it are different categories of knowledge. The intelligence she had carried out of Cairo contributed, in ways that could not be cleanly traced, to a specific shift in Israeli strategic assessment. The question that had occupied Israeli decision-makers for most of 1974 was whether Anwar Sadat's peace overtures were genuine or tactical, whether he was actually seeking a political settlement, or buying time to rebuild an Egyptian military that the Yom Kippur War had damaged more severely than Egypt's public posture admitted. Khalil's assessment, delivered on a veranda in late March to a woman he believed was simply easy to talk to, had been unambiguous on this point. The peace was not a strategy, it was a recognition. Egypt could not fight again, not in 1974. Possibly not for years. That assessment reached the right desks. It was corroborated by separate collection. It informed the margins of a process that had many contributors. The Israeli approach to the American brokered conversations that would eventually produce the Camp David Accords. A peace treaty between Israel and Egypt was signed in March 1979. Whether it would have happened differently or later, or not at all, without what was said on that veranda, impossible to say. Intelligence does not produce outcomes. It shapes the conditions in which decisions are made. The decisions belong to other people. What can be said is that the intelligence was real. The source was genuine. The access had worked. What also can be said is what it cost. Miriam was not reassigned to another long cover operation. The decision was framed as a recognition of her specific capabilities, Her particular quality of genuine connection made her better suited to short duration work where depth of relationship would not have time to form. This was accurate as far as it went. What it did not say was the thing the debriefers had observed and documented in language that was professional and careful and amounted, plain terms, to this: she had gotten too close, not to the intelligence, to the world the intelligence lived inside. She had spent 17 weeks being someone else in a city that had become, despite everything, real to her. The residue of that reality had not fully cleared. She continued working. She was, by every operational measure, effective. She did not run another long operation. She did not discuss why. Barakat found out a decade later, not from any official source, from a journalist who had been researching Israeli intelligence operations in Egypt during the 1970s and had pieced together enough of the outline, the actress, the theater critic, the general's circle, to approach him. By his own account, his first response was disbelief. His second was anger. Third was something he described to the journalist as more difficult to name. He said, "She was genuinely interested in the things we talked about. I would stake my professional judgment on that. What I cannot tell you is whether that makes it better or worse." He did not publish anything about it. He did not speak about it publicly again. He continued writing about Egyptian theater until his retirement in 1991. General Fuad Khalil retired in 1976. He died in 1988, 12 years before an Egyptian military historian, writing a private memoir that circulated among a small community of intelligence scholars and was never formally published, suggested that Khalil had understood, from relatively early in the operation, Dina Farouk was not what she presented herself to be. The historian's account was drawn from a single conversation with Khalil in the mid-1980s, recorded in handwritten notes. It was not verified by any independent source, but if the account was accurate, it meant this: the most significant intelligence the operation produced. Khalil's assessment of Egyptian military weakness, characterization of Sassut's peace initiative as strategic necessity rather than political choice, had not been extracted. It had been given by a man who had looked at the woman across from him, made his own professional judgment, and decided that certain truths, delivered through a channel no one could trace back to him, might serve his country better than silence. Not betrayal, something more complicated than betrayal. A senior intelligence official making a private calculation about what his country actually needed, concluding that the answer was for its adversary to understand clearly that war was no longer a realistic option. He could not say this officially. No channel existed for it. No institution would have permitted it. So he said it to a woman on a veranda on a Tuesday evening in late March, and he watched her carry it out of his city. He retired 2 years later and did not speak publicly about any of it. Whether he knew she would never come back, whether the goodbye at the end of that last evening was a goodbye he understood, the record does not say. Hana Salah's observation was never formally reported. It remained a handwritten note in the margin of a closed Egyptian counterintelligence file, reviewed by a researcher years later and cited in a footnote of a paper that almost no one read. She had been right. She had known she was right. She had waited for certainty that never arrived because the woman she was watching had left before certainty was possible. In the bureaucratic architecture of intelligence work, a right answer that arrives too late to matter is filed under inconclusive and closed. There is a particular kind of operation that intelligence services do not teach in training and do not include in doctrine because it does not fit cleanly into any category of success or failure. An operation where the intelligence was real, the access was genuine, the mission objectives were met, and where, at the same time, the cover permanently altered the person who wore it. The source may have been running his own calculation the entire time, and the woman who almost caught it waited alone with the right answer until it no longer mattered. All of those things were true simultaneously. That is not a contradiction. That is the actual texture of this work. The version told in official histories, where operations succeed or fail and the meaning is clean, but the version that the people inside them carry afterward. If this story made you think differently about what intelligence operations actually cost, not strategically but humanly, then share it with someone who thinks this work is simple. It isn't. It never was.